Hi. Since there are two chapters this week and there's some chance I'll get sucked back into the hospital, I thought I'd record an overview of the two chapters. Because there are two, I really, even if I were there live, wouldn't be going very far beyond the chapters. So I'm just going to highlight. So you can listen and look at the book as you wish. And I'll try to keep it somewhere between an hour and an hour and a half. So here we go. So first we're doing hearing, vestibular, perception, taste, and smell. A ton of topics. My doctoral dissertation was in the auditory system, and I will be talking about some elements of that for sure. The vestibular system is intimately related to the auditory system. They share a sensory nerve. And taste and smell, I really don't do too much with, but they are of interest, and we will touch on those. And I think there are kids judge topics that are related certainly to taste. Oh, and there's someone also doing Can You Hear Me? So this is relevant. Okay. Whoops. Of course, there are terms to learn. And the basics of sound, these graphics are good. Cycles per second, how many times a wave repeats within a second, also referred to as Hertz, or we would say Hertz, but he was a German. So the pitch of sound is largely defined by how many times it repeats per second, cycles per second, whereas the amplitude is heavily related to how loud the sound is, although there are exceptions. So there's definitions, and hearing's important. It's pretty darn important for us. It's arguably more important for some other species. And our auditory system, in terms of its evolutionary history, reflects that we used to live in the water, and then we crawled out of the water, and now we live in an ocean of air. And the ocean of air that surrounds us can convey waves of energy, just like we're seeing here. And we have taken elements of the sensory systems of largely fish and crawled on land with them, and they serve us pretty darn well. And there's a lot of terms here. Fourier analysis, notice it's capitalized, so it's a human. Sounds French because it is. Again, going back to when the French did important things. It's used in a lot of things. It takes complex waveforms and simplifies them, and you'll run into that quite a bit. And here's Hertz, abbreviated with the capital H. We often say timbre, other people say timbre. This is what makes a piano sound different from a xylophone, sound different from a trumpet, largely, even though they're all playing the same sound. Decibels, tenth of bells. Notice the B is capitalized. Alexander Graham Bell. The auditory system has an amazing sensitivity range, and decibels, tenths of bells, which is a log scale, is important to be able to deal with that huge range of intensities that we can respond to. Now, the pinna, of course, we have two, so we have pin A, is your external ear. And if I were standing in front of you live, I would wiggle my ears because I can do that. I used to hate the choir when I was in church as a child, and I could make rumbling noises in my ears. And I sat there in church rumbling away the choir, and the woman behind me said her child, "Oh, look, that boy up there can wiggle his ears." And I was very excited because I didn't know I could wiggle my ears. I was producing a rumbling sound by a different mechanism. And you can't hear the rumble, but I can do that too. So external ear canal, don't stick things in your ear canal. And these parts, different animals have different ears. The middle ear doesn't get a lot of press, but it's very important. There are 3 bones in each middle ear, the ossicles. They are the smallest bones in your body, and they can ossify. The calcium can form on them, and that can form hearing loss. So we have 3 bones in each ear, and we have 2 muscles associated with them. And I think this book will name those. There it is right there. Tensor tympani and stapedius. So the 3 bones, as named here, the malleus, incus, and stapes, hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And the tensor tympani is the muscle attached to the malleus, because the malleus is attached to the tympanic membrane. And then the middle bone doesn't have anything, but the stapedius is connected, no surprise, to the stapes. And they're interesting. I don't fully understand them. If you know anybody who can, who's an audiologist, who can measure acoustic emissions, or they can do impedance audiometry, I have a study we could do. Don't worry about remembering either of those terms, but certainly know these parts. Okay, and there's, brilliant pictures, better than your coloring book. The coloring book has a number of plates assigned to these 2 chapters. There's the tympanic membrane. There's the malleus, incus, and stapes. You can probably see that the bones are getting smaller as they go in. So I had a former student who was wearing high heels, and she used one foot to step on the other foot, and the high heel went right through her shoe and foot. So these bones don't increase energy, they concentrate it. And here's the vestibular system up here, which I'm not going to say very much about it at all. But here's the auditory system that I'm interested in, cochlea or cochlea, which is named because it looks like a snail shell, because it does. And here's a close-up, and here are your tensor tympani and stapedius muscles. It's a beautiful figure. Then you have your receptors. They're called hair cells. Why? Because they have hairs. And there's 3 membranes to worry about here: scala vestibuli. I'm sorry. These are the chambers: scala tympani, vestibuli, scala media, and scala tympani. The tectorial membrane is very important to us. I'm pretty sure that this is a graphics error on the part of the artist. The end of the tectorial membrane, you can sort of see it. It doesn't look like it's popped and has pulled back like you ripped a tendon off of a muscle. Well, you have, because in real life, this stretches a bit and attaches out here. But you can see your outer hair cells, 3 ranks, and your inner hair cells, 1 rank. So there's a lot more outers than inners. However, most of what you hear comes from the inners, not the outers. So most of your auditory nerve, sensory information comes from the inner hair cells. What's with the outers? Well, they get a lot of input from the brainstem, and they are little muscles, and they're attached to the tectorial membrane. and they can change this dynamic pretty robustly. Now here's an anatomically correct picture of the cochlea with cross sections throughout the cochlea. And if you look at it a while, you can appreciate that near to stapes, the cochlea is pretty big, and therefore the scales are pretty big, and the membranes are pretty big, including the basilar membrane, which is important to us. And as you go around and around in a snail, you're going back in time. They started off as an itty bitty snail, and then they grew and they grew, and as they grew, their shell got bigger and their hole got bigger, and that is, in terms of the shape, that's true here too. So the chambers of the cochlea are biggest near where the sounds come in, and they are smallest at the end, at the apex. And if you're in fluid dynamics, that's important. And there's the scala, and there's the round window is a window that's round, and it has no bone on it. It's just a naked window, which means membrane. The oval window is what's under the stapes, which is right there, and it's pretty much covered by bone. So this is where the energy comes in, and then it runs around the cochlea, and fluid doesn't compress all that well. It's got to release the pressure somewhere, and that's what the round window is for. So when pressure goes in the oval, it kind of, the outer, the pressure can push out on the round window, and you don't get much or any destruction of hair cells in the inner ear. Although if you listen to loud music or you fire weapons, you definitely would. We had a faculty member on campus who was a tank commander, and he rode around in tanks a lot. And geez, he talked about because his ears were destroyed. And here's an oddity. So we know that the cochlea itself is getting smaller as you go from the base to the apex. But the basilar membrane, this purple thing, which we saw before, starts off relatively narrow and gets wider and wider. So as the bones are closing in, the basilar membrane is getting wider. And this is physics, and this is important. And not only is it getting wider, it's getting floppier. So at the base, the basilar membrane is narrow and tight, and it changes continuously, which should make you think about the dreaded relative refractory period. But as you get to the end of the cochlea, you're going to surprisingly have a very narrow cochlea, but the basilar membrane will be wide and floppy. And there's a representation of frequencies. And here's the base where we start, and it's if. And when you were young, you could hear 20,000 hertz. And as you age, these cells are going to die. And if you also expose them to loud sounds, they're going to die. You can lose a fair amount of the high frequencies and nothing bad will happen. But eventually, if you keep doing this, you're going to lose frequencies that are involved in consonants. And try to imagine how difficult English is to understand if it's all vowels. Not easy to understand. So inners and outers, stereocilia, tinctorial membrane, already mentioned all those. There's the cells again. Again, this part of the tectonic membrane is gently attached out here. And acetylcholine, glutamate, and GABA, and all the stuff we've all learned about before. Now, looking at this, The perception of sound largely depends on the glutamate release from the inner hair cells onto the cells of the auditory nerve, which can be modulated by acetylcholine. And what's going on out here, some sensory information from there, which is being indicated here, but these are also little muscles, so it's complicated. Tip links, yes. And you, in the somatosensory chapter, you saw how changes in cell membranes can open or close channels, open channels in Pacinian corpuscles. And the same kind of thing goes on here and in parts of the vestibular system. And there's an electron micrograph. I'll give you a second look at that. Tell me, is this a scanning EM or a transmission EM? It's transmission. Why do I say that? Because it looks incredibly thin. There's no three-dimensional properties to that at all. And we do most of our science with that. And oh, look, they caught some tip links. And here's ions that we know and love, tip links and vesicles, and depolarization, and the exponential all over again. Autoacoustic emissions. When sounds go into your ears, you get a little emission of sound out of the ear, which is largely based on the outer hair cells. Who's more sensitive in general, men or women? And the answer is women. Men are insensitive brutes, and they hear better. And their acoustic emissions are greater. So women have more sensitive hearing. They have more pronounced autoacoustic emissions, suggesting that the emissions are related to the increase in sensitivity. An exception to that is that at least some lesbian women do not have more sensitive hearing, and their autoacoustic emissions are not more sensitive than men. Cochlea to the cortex. All right, now I have a diagram for you to process, and I'll lecture about it for the next quiz, which relates to this colorful diagram down here. You have the brainstem, you have cells from the left, you have cells from the right. The book says superior olivary nucleus, suggesting it's one thing, a nucleus. Remembering that nucleus also means the nucleus of a cell, but a collection of neural cells, cell bodies in the central nervous system are also referred to as a nucleus, but it's not a nucleus. It's a complex, and we'll come back to this. Do not attempt to memorize this, because I'm going to give you a figure that's way more accurate and comprehensive. But the general pathway is worth knowing. And there's our that's the PAG around there, which is not able to say. And this is the medial geniculate, suggesting there's also a lateral geniculate, and there is. The medial deals with sound, and sound deals with music. So music, M, medial. And the lateral geniculate, which we'll see in the visual chapter, deals with vision. Vision deals with light. Light, lateral, both subdivisions of thalamus. And oh, good. So here, unlike in the graphics, they say superior olivary nuclei. I prefer complex, but it's better. And still, I'll give you a figure that will make it better. That's colorful. Cats are popular for this research. Certainly, that's not us. But it shows how in the inferior colliculus there seems to be a localization of sensory functioning that relates to frequency, which is nice. And then we have human auditory cortex to random sounds and speech is special. All right, pitch. In the chapter on general sensory information, there was a discussion of how you can combine information from different neurons to cobble together our ability to see or hear or perceive an intense range of stimuli. Some of that definitely goes on with the auditory system in relation to pitch. Now, you remember at our best, we could do about 20,000 hertz. I didn't mention it, but we go down to about 20 hertz. How do we do that huge range of frequencies? Well, one way is place code. And you may be wondering, why did I have to learn that the tympanic membrane is in a bony chamber that's getting narrower, but the tympanic membrane is getting wider. And as it gets wider, it's getting floppier. Why? Because of physics, which means I can't help you. That tunes the tectorial membrane. And if you've ever gone to the beach where there's an ocean with any regularity, you'll notice that some days the waves crash fairly far out from the beach, and some days the waves crash like basically right on the beach. Well, part of that is frequency tuning. The waves interact with the slope of the sand below, and the energy breaks at different points. And that's also true for frequencies. So very high frequencies are going to expend their energy very soon after going to the cochlea, where the tympanic membrane is narrow and stiff. Whereas as you go lower and lower frequencies, the breaking of the waves will move down. So the membrane, the tympanic membrane, is tuned spatially. You can walk down it with your fingers in a sense, and as you walk down it, you're moving along piano keys that go from high frequencies near the tympanic membrane to near the oval window to lower frequencies as you get toward the end of the cochlea. But that's still not good enough, because we can still go lower in the frequencies that we can hear. So we also have temporal coding. So we know we have waves, and you can have, as it points out here, for like a 500 hertz sound, a neuron can fire 500 times a second if appropriately stimulated, which is relevant to the relative refractory period. And the neurons on the basilar membrane can phase lock. And when the frequencies go too low to differentially affect the basilar membrane, you can have individual cells not in the basilar membrane, but in the hair cells associated with the basilar membrane, and they can fire in synchrony. The brain, when it's dealing with higher frequencies, says, well, where was I touched? Was I touched near the oval window? Was I touched in the middle of the basilar membrane? Was I touched near the end of the basilar membrane, like going along a piano? But when you get so low that you don't get differential touching, then you say, well, how fast are my neurons firing? And we can do temporal coding. We're pretty clever. Our auditory system works quite well, although some of you listen to too loud sounds. So you have infra and ultra and brainstem and binaural. There's a word you should learn to the point where you don't have to think about it. Binaural means both sides. Also, practice your ipsilateral and contralateral. Ipsilateral means same side, contralateral means opposite side. Concepts you had to deal with certainly in the somatosensory systems. Now you're trying to localize sounds in space, and can you hear this? That group will be dealing with that. When you think about your head, remember that we are living in an ocean of air, and your head is like an island in an ocean of air. And there are waves in the ocean of air. And if your island is big enough, there's a sound shadow on the side of your head away from incoming waves. So if you're Captain Jack Sparrow and you want to anchor your ship, you find an island and then you go to the side of the island away from the incoming waves and anchor there, because the island casts a shadow and it's calmer over there. And because it's calmer over there, if that side has an ear on it, that ear will get less intense sounds. And you can sometimes localize sound in space by saying, well, my left ear, it's loud, my right ear, it's not so loud, so it must be to the left. Of course, you can turn your head directly at the sound source or directly away from the sound source. And even though you will still be casting a shadow, the shadow will either be in front of your eyes or behind your head. And that's not very useful for localization, although it is, because both ears are now getting the same intensity sound. So you will assume the sound is coming from either in front of you or behind you or over your head or on the ground. But so it's not nothing, but there's still information. And there we go. So there's your island, and there are your waves, and there's your sound shadow. That's useful. And then there's also latency differences, which is a little bit harder to explain. But this is how we detect tsunamis. We put buoys out there under the surface of the ocean, and we wait until a buoy pops, and you say, "Oh my God, something big went by that buoy." And then there are buoys around the buoy, and then you get another buoy popping, and oh, the wave went from buoy A to buoy B, so it's going toward Indonesia, and we better sound an alert. So good theories, good discussion. Hopefully I've given you enough to help you read that. A lot of work has been done in owls, and this is an example of that. Why this is useful is it shows there's action potential propagating on the red line, and there's also an accidental propagating on the left line. And you'll remember spatial and temporal summation from the action potential chapter. So you could have cells detect, that like cell 5 is being hit by the left and the right at the same time. Now, since the right is a shorter path, then the sound is a little off to the right. If the sounds were coming in equally from both ears, the action potentials would tie at cell 3. And so you have like a threshold situation where if the action potentials hit virtually at the same time, then it's cell 5 and it's to the right. Or if the red line's a little earlier, it's 4, and it's about even red and blue, then it's 3. So you see logic, and it's well discussed. And there's our friend the bat. By the way, not all bats echolocate. Auditory cortex. This is where I tend to not tell you much more information. And then there's scanning and music and sweet music and amusia. Certainly I've run into people like that. And that's a good read. I leave it to you. Tone deaf people, and this is the relatively new technology, which I still find to be magical, where you can follow pathways in the brain. Hearing loss, major disorder, Conduction deafness, I mentioned calcification of the ossicles, that can cause problems. By the way, chiropractic is probably based on this. Um, if your ossicles are calcified, a loud sound can sometimes knock the calcium off, and suddenly you can hear. And if your faith healer or whatever slams their hands into your ears, you get possibly damaging levels of sound input. But every once in a while, the calcium falls away, and suddenly, praise the Lord, I've been healed. I can hear, and it's true. Sensory neural is less prone to faith healing or chiropractic manipulations. And there's a discussion of that. Oh boy, that is not pretty. Cochlear in the hair cells. Very nice pictures. Good discussion. Yeah. I don't understand why we allow vehicles to travel our streets where when it drives by, babies wake up screaming. It doesn't have to be true, but we do it. And whenever I walk around campus and I see people operating power tools, I always check to see if they're wearing hearing protection. They're getting better at that, thanks to your federal government passing laws. Ringing in the ear tinnitus, that can be, if you have had, you had it, if you've been in a loud environment and you walk out of it and your ears are ringing, that's an example of that. But boy, if you get that chronically, it can be incredibly disruptive of your life. Really, really bad. You don't want it. And cochlear implants. And there's videos of babies hearing their mother's voice for the first time, really touching. And now getting into something again that I rarely lecture on specifically, but this is the vestibular system. Notice you have three semicircular canals, and they deal with three planes of motion. I don't know why I find it so disturbing to have a rod coming out of a person's nose. And the cupula is displaced inside the ampulla. I don't like the arrow. In olden times, and maybe even still today, drugs used to be distributed in glass ampullas, and they would have like a little teardrop top, and there'd be often a piece of metal with powdered diamond on it, and you would etch the neck of the teardrop thing on the top and snap it off, and then you could get at your drug. That was a beautiful way of storing drugs for a long time. So an ampulla stores things, although these channels are open, so it's not like the drug distribution. When I was living in the Summit, the house before the last house before the end of the marriage, I think we bought, we were going to buy a cupola for the top of the garage because we had a weather vane we liked. So when you see old barns and houses built by people like me, you'll often see these little structures on the roof. That's the cupola. And this is open. So the cupola is flying in the breeze, and it can tell you which way the wind is blowing without bending. Very, very nicely discussed. Very interesting system. There's utricle and the sacula. There's I don't apologize, but there are terms you just have to memorize. And of course, there are vestibular nuclei, which I'm less interested in than the auditory. nuclei. And oh my God, taste and smell. I'm very interested in both of these, particularly smell, because at my age, I smell things a lot. Because if you can still smell well, you'll probably last another decade or so. Because your olfactory system, those receptors live in a rough world and they have to be replaced all the time by neurogenesis. And if you're dying and your cells are not replacing themselves very well, one of the things you lose is your ability to smell things. So I'm always sniffing because I want to die. And there's, oh boy, that's a beautifully stained section. Papillae and taste buds. There's different types of papillae. You may have been taught in grade school about different parts of the tongue having different preferred tastes. That's a myth, but they keep teaching it to people in education. And then they're going to talk about chemistry of taste and what kinds of stimuli affect the different kinds of receptors. And I can't improve on that discussion. We used to do this in Kids Judge, but I don't like turning kids' tongues blue. Super tasters tend to have more papillae. And sometimes it's as dramatic as this. And if you have more papillae, you have more receptors and you taste more things. You may also be more sensitive to capsaicin and chili peppers and spicy foods, but for a different reason. They do tend to vary, but they are for independent reasons. But boy, that's a difference. Yep. But don't turn children's tongues blue. And then there's the pathways. And path coding theories of how taste occurs. Labeled lines comes up again, as did in the somatic chapter. And then the olfactory epithelium, your olfactory receptors, your first cranial nerve is, you'll never see it. It's inside the top of your nose. And those receptors send axons through little holes in your skull to connect to your olfactory bulb. So your olfactory bulb is not the first cranial nerve, but there's a beautiful picture there. So you have olfactory receptors, which are constantly being replaced by these support cells. And then when the neuron shows up, it has to send an axon up and connect to things up here. And there's really beautiful research on mitral cells and how this all puts itself together. And glomerulus, you may remember that term being discussed in relation to granule cells and how they hold hands. And there's the amygdala, an important emotional structure, as we'll see. Boy, that's a good graphic. So the amygdala lives inside your temporal lobe, right in front of your hippocampus, and that has a special role in olfaction. There are other pathways as well. And second messengers and you're just going to have to stare at this and look at the bed. But, it should all be quite familiar by now, sodium and calcium and the metabotropic receptors, at least for some, for olfaction, yeah. And here's our good friend the rat, and this is how the olfactory system is put together. And notice the colors in the stripes, which should remind you of the inferior colliculus and the auditory system. So different sensory systems use parallel ways of processing things. And there's the glomeruli and the mitral cells. And pheromones. I'm not. I know. I'm on the fence in terms of humans and pheromones. But if you've ever seen a rat or a cat run into an unknown smell on the ground, they drop their mouth open and they breathe through their mouth to try to get the chemicals up onto these receptors behind their incisors. And they have their own pathway, and uh, they're important for pheromones, and certainly they exist and function in rats and cats. I'm not convinced about humans. From our nasal organs, and then there's the end of the chapter story about different body parts, and there's us, and there's a mouse and a fruit fly, and because I have another chapter to deal with, I think I will pause my recording here and make sure it actually works.